Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and this is a Lamborghini Huraco P250S. Now this is a really interesting car because it was initially built to try and take on the cheaper Ferraris and even the mighty 911. And unfortunately, commercially, it was definitely a failure. Only 776 of these were built versus about 12,000 308s and God knows how many tens of thousands, if not more than that, of 911s. Now things went wrong pretty much straight away. Although the American market was a prime target, they only managed to sell 23 Huracos in the USA. That's also because emissions and safety regulations really hampered the car. It meant it had the bigger bumpers, it was heavier, but also it was forced to use the 2-litre engine under emissions, and Motor Trend, the magazines that were around at the time, Road and Track rather than Motor Trend, I think, didn't give it very good reviews. So off to a very bad start. Today we're going to have a good look at this car and examine what went wrong, and we're going to look at 3 specific areas. First of all, the general design, the looks of the Huraco. Secondly, the technology that was employed. And then lastly, we're going to take it out and see if perhaps the driving experience was to blame or if it was something else altogether. So in terms of looks, certainly the Huraco isn't quite as dramatic as a 308 GTB or a 308 GTS, but really being a 2+2, the car to compare it to is the 308 GT4. They both have wedge profiles, and I have to say that on balance, I think that the Huraco was a more successful shape. So Gandini designed both cars, and the GT4, although some people don't like it, I do like it, but there's a couple of angles where it looks really incongruous. For example, straight ahead at the front, and then there's a sort of a rear 3/4 which looks a bit odd. This maybe isn't super showy, but it looks great from just about every angle. I also absolutely love how the swage line that goes across the middle of the car contrasts with the gills. So very, very pretty detailing as well on this car. But let's talk about the technology, because that is quite interesting. So a Ferrari 308, maybe the main competitor to this, had double wishbones all round. It had rack and pinion steering and a double overhead cam V8. The Huraco has some similarities. It is a transverse V8, but technically it just seems to be worse in every way. So instead of having double wishbones all round, it has struts. And a very odd choice for a car like this. It has worm and roller steering. And in this car, it's a 2.5 V8 and it is just a single cam. They did also make a 3-litre later on, which had a double overhead cam arrangement. But for this one, obviously, technically, doesn't sound like it quite matches up. You can't compare it to the 911 technically because those are so off the scale. So perhaps it was only single overhead cam and a little bit underpowered compared to the 308 because Ferrari declared 250 horsepower, Lamborghini 220. But nonetheless, this is a very significant engine because it was made bespoke for this application. It was only used in this car and in the 2 other derivatives. Altogether, only 1,200 of the 3 versions were made, and I've heard them go, and they sound amazing. So I really look forward to taking it out and seeing how it feels on the road. Quite interesting because you sit in here, driving position, more about that later, but to start it up you have to give it quite a bit of throttle, and that throttle pedal is really pretty heavy. Right, first gear and off we go. And interestingly, this engine, I've driven it already this morning around for a bit. It's a very tractable engine, so much so that you can almost pull off without giving it any throttle at all. If you want to see more videos on quirky, interesting classics like this, please do consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell because it really does make a difference. It sounds and feels like a much bigger engine. Now this is pure Italian 70s, so I kind of fit in it. I have to sort of squat down. reach to the wheel is good. Everything else, for me personally, I'm quite tall, 6'1", and could be changed. The interior though is really very nice. It's got like the older style of Alcantara, so it's worn away in a lovely patina on this car. This is 35,000 miles. It's never been sort of fully restored. It's had a sort of a paint job outside, but it's very original. The gearbox is a little bit recalcitrant, as you can hear there. It needs to have the linkage adjusted, so it's a bit tricky, and we can't judge the car based on that because it's not working to its full efficiency. But in every other way, this is an absolutely lovely car. As I mentioned, in terms of the way it's finished, the leatherwork, the stitching, the dash, I think it's a bit better quality than the equivalent Ferrari, and I would say not far off a 911. It really feels like a solidly built car, this, which you probably wouldn't be expecting at all. The pedal box is absolutely tiny, so much so that I had to go home and change my shoes, take my trainers off and put these ones on, because otherwise it is really difficult to hit that throttle without touching the sides or touching the brake pedal. So that definitely keeps your mind concentrated. Now, the way the dash is laid out, you probably get used to, but initially you're looking straight ahead for your instruments, your speed and your tacho, and they're right on the sides. I mean, the good thing about that is that they are definitely very visible. I do like the chunky switchgear, which does feel like a pretty well-built car, this. There's not really much sort of squeaking or rattling. The body feels stiff. Let's just see how it goes, how that 2.5 V8 goes down the road. Dogleg first gear. Unlike the later Lambos and the later versions of this car, I think, it doesn't have the gated shifter. It doesn't really feel any the worse for it. That throttle is such an oddity because it's heavy and it's very long travel. Now, I was thinking about it earlier and thinking maybe it's not supposed to be like that. It feels almost a little bit too heavy, but I can feel with my foot that it's springing. The springing on it is heavy. It doesn't feel like there's a problem with the mechanism. So I think it's actually supposed to be like that. And I guess the long travel maybe is a rudimentary form of early traction control, but it's probably the longest travel throttle I have ever used. Additionally to that, the steering is very, very low geared. Very well weighed though, and really nice and light. Also, I'm sure you'll agree, that V8 sounds absolutely wonderful. And that's one clear area where it is better than a 308. It sounds way better. As standard, 308s just do not sound very good. And they sound like a sort of a weird four-cylinder. This sounds sublime, this lump. It is coloured by that long travel stiff throttle, which I think makes it feel less responsive than it actually is in real life. It rides pretty well. The cabin is a little bit cramped, but at least the design is very pleasing to the eye. In terms of practicalities, there are definitely some good points. Yes, those rear seats are very small, there isn't much space, but the GT4 was the same, the 911 is pretty much the same as well. And if you're a bit shorter than me, you can pull the seat forward and make a little bit more room there. I would say though, anything more than an 8-year-old, they're probably going to struggle. You have a decent capacity boot at the back, which is separate from the engine bay, so pretty usable as well. The steering is light, and even at parking speeds, it's not particularly heavy on this. The quality aspect is surprising as well. But we're coming up to the S's here, so let's see how it acquits itself through those. Very tractable, it seems that it really comes on cam around 4. In deference to Martin, lovely owner who brought it down, I'm only revving it to 6 today because the belts are due, although it's had no mileage since, but all the same, from 4 to 6 is where it feels like it's at its best. Let's just take it through the gears again and absorb that lovely V8. Absolutely glorious. It does feel a bit heavy and slightly feels like it's going to push the front out wide on the tighter stuff. Oh, I love the engine. The engine is astounding. It feels and sounds much better than a 308 lump on a standard exhaust anyway. It's a very addictive thing. And again, okay, so perhaps the tighter stuff isn't its forte. Also, it's a little bit vague off-center. I think that worm and roller steering doesn't help on that front. But it's very, very sweet on the sort of more flowing bends like this. It's lovely, gives you lovely feedback. And then you have that bellowing little V8, which sounds like a much bigger engine behind you. Also, if you look in the mirror, you can see it in the rearview mirror as you're looking out the back. Visibility isn't really that bad over the slatted cover. Good 3/4 windows as well. So clearly there are some things that you would have to get used to if you were going to drive one of these. Driving position isn't suited to taller people. The controls in terms of the pedal box are a little bit iffy, where you definitely want to have smaller feet and you have to get used to that stiff throttle, which makes rev matching also quite difficult. But on the whole, it seems to drive really pretty well. So I don't think that that was the reason why it wasn't a commercial success. I think there's a couple of possible reasons. As a design, although it's a really, really pretty car, it's just not as dramatic as some of the competition and not as iconic, I guess, or well known as the 911 shape. Plus, Ferrari had a long-standing name to rely on, whereas Lamborghini at this stage had really only got going, so it was probably more difficult for them to sell on name alone. Not just that, but towards the end of the production run of the Urraco, between I think it was 78 or 79 and 84, Lamborghini was essentially bankrupt. The Silhouette came after this car, the Jalpa after that. The Silhouette sold in tiny numbers. I think it was 50 that were made. And of course, having a company that's bankrupt is not going to help you sell cars. Now, looking at it as a modern classic, you will never see one of these on the road. They are so rare, so unusual. The engine is an absolute gem. It's not an out-and-out sports car, but it's still nice to drive, especially driven on the right kind of road. Ignore the problems I've had with the gearbox on this one. It just needs some adjustments, so it's not representative. As a classic, it is incredibly alluring. And yes, it does have a few issues, but I think it was a question of naming and luck, most of all, that explains why these weren't more successful than ultimately they were. If you have a car that you'd like me to do a review on, I would love to do a Silhouette, and I'd love to do a Jalpa in particular since today's Lamborghini Day. Please get in touch. This is the best address. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to seeing you for the next video, and thank you very much for Martin for bringing this down.